Well, welcome to the 700 Club. More than $150 million. And that's what the Palestinian Authority paid to families of terrorists just in 2020. The pay-to-slay policy is still in force, using our tax dollars to fund terror campaigns.
In 2018, Congress passed a law cutting off certain economic aid to the Palestinians to stop the practice. Now, more legislation is needed to finish the task. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka reports.
Lawmakers on Capitol Hill are hoping to move quickly and expand the Taylor Force Act and finally put an end to the payments and rewards that are being given out to the families of terrorists.
Not a day goes by when Stuart Force does not think about his son Taylor, taken from the world 6 years ago.
Probably more like an hour goes by that we don't miss Taylor, that we, you know, there will always be an emptiness.
Taylor Force was a U.S. Army veteran murdered by a Palestinian terrorist in Israel in 2016. His family made it their mission to end the Palestinian Authority's so-called pay-for-slay policy, where the PA pays stipends to the families of the terrorists who commit the crimes.
It's sad to say, but the same countries that are hell-bent on destroying the United States, on destroying Israel, have no problem using U.S. dollars to fund their terror campaigns.
In 2018, the Taylor Force Act was signed into law attempting to curb the payments, but hundreds of millions of dollars are still being paid out. Force's family hopes a new bill, the Taylor Force Martyr Prevention Act, will help complete their mission of ending the payments. The bill targets banks in the Middle East, and Congressman Doug Lamborn is sponsoring it in the House.
The Palestinian Authority has made it really clear that their intention is to keep these payments going. And so what we're trying to do is go at the financial institutions that prop up the Palestinian Authority and try to take away their ability to make this happen. We take away their ability to have correspondent accounts in the United States.
Our approach from the original Taylor Force Act was to keep the United States taxpayer from sending money to the Palestinians. And they use that to fund their terrorist program. So it bothers me, and we will do anything we can to stop them from doing it.
The bill has already been introduced in the Senate, and it does have a Democratic co-sponsor in the House. Congressman Lamborn says he wants to get the bill passed before potential new members of Congress are seated in January. Matt Galka, CBN News.
Well, it's great to see Congress taking the lead in this, and I encourage you to call your senators, call your House of Representatives, your member of Congress, and tell them how much you support this, that you want our tax dollars to not fund terrorists anymore. In the Palestinian Authority, they're called martyrs, the shaheed. They're honored. They put up statues to them. They name streets after them. They name soccer teams after them. They put them on pedestals and then reward their families financially. And they're using our tax dollars to do it. And that was the whole intent of the Taylor Force Act. Let's stop that. Under the Trump administration, they went even further. They said, we're going to shut down our consulate to you. We're going to turn that into an embassy to Israel and recognize Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel. They stopped the payments to UNRWA. The UN was helping fund incitement and training its incitement in the schools in the Palestinian Authority. And then after all of that, the PA doubled down and said, we're not ever going to stop these payments. And then to underline that, they no longer issue their budget. So we don't know how much went in 2021. They are shutting down access to any foreign observers to how they spend their money. And so in response, should we try to open up a new consulate to them? Well, that's exactly what the Biden administration has done, the State Department has done. They attempted to do that, but forgot about international law, that they needed Israel's permission to do that. And so that didn't take off. That was a real stumble in the first year of the administration. But here's another bigger stumble. and that is restarting negotiations with Iran to try to get that nuclear deal done. But there's more good news. Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's saying, well, if we can't get guidance from the administration on how to deal with Iran, I'm going to start drafting legislation that will put this and put it into law, how to deal with Iran. And that ties in with what the UN has now said. The UN Atomic Agency has issued a warning on Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That is right, Gordon. That UN watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, reports Iran now has enough material to build a nuclear bomb. An agency report obtained by the Wall Street Journal says Iran has about 95 pounds of uranium enriched to 60%. That's above the threshold needed to build one nuclear bomb. The report also says Iran has the capability to complete the final step of enriching uranium up to 90% in just a matter of weeks. While as inflation continues to soar here at home, President Biden is turning his attention to the economy. He met with Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell Tuesday to show his support for the Fed's efforts to fight inflation. Still, poll numbers show the public is feeling the pain of high prices and blaming the president. CBN Charlene Aaron has the story.
Oval Office meeting with Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, the president said his top goal is fighting inflation and highlighted the agency's role.
My plan is to address inflation. It starts with a simple proposition: respect the Fed.
Right now, that means supporting a series of hikes in interest rates. Critics charge the administration is late to the game. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen admitting she was slow to recognize the danger last year when she said the risk of inflation was small and manageable.
I think I was wrong then about the path that inflation would take.
CBN financial editor Drew Parkhill.
The administration was wrong on this for months, okay? They had repeated warnings before they undertook their big COVID relief plan. Okay, they were warned by top Democratic economists, Larry Summers and so forth. Don't do this. This is big spending. This is going to fuel the worst inflation in a generation. That's exactly what happened.
This as Americans are struggling with skyrocketing prices.
Food, gas, everything. It's hard for you to make a living and go to work.
Gas prices keep reaching record highs, today hitting $4.67 per gallon. One station in Los Angeles charging over $8 per gallon. As prices climb, the president's poll numbers are plunging. Voters are angry about the state of the economy heading into the midterm elections, putting Democrats' control of the House and Senate at risk. The White House plans a month-long focus on the economy, an attempt to show the president's dedication to fighting inflation. CBN chief political analyst David Brody says the move lacks substance.
I mean, this feels very much like a playbook from the White House, right? It's June month, or it's June, so therefore it's going to be, breakthrough inflation month, and they're going to have some sort of theme involved, and here comes the op-ed, and here comes certain press conferences and policy initiatives and executive orders.
Meanwhile, the unemployment rate dropped to 3.6% in April, but it might be too little too late. A new Gallup poll found nearly half of Americans call the country's economic conditions poor. Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Thanks, Charlene. A controversy is brewing over the U.S. Department of Agriculture's position on discrimination and its impact on school nutrition programs. The department's Food and Nutrition Service announced it will follow the Biden administration's executive order prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Critics charge that could mean elementary and high schools that don't implement policies such as allowing transgender athletes to compete in women's sports or letting transgender boys use girls' bathrooms and showers could be denied federal funds for nutrition programs. Well, all of this is part of the Biden administration's goal to amend Title IX, the 50-year-old federal law ending sex discrimination in education. Supporters say it's about expanding rights for students, while critics say it will actually destroy women's sports, privacy, and more. CBN's Jenna Browder brings us the story.
Major changes are coming for Title IX, the federal law that protects girls' and women's rights in education. The Biden administration wants to change the way schools respond to sexual misconduct on campus and codify protections for LGBTQ students by changing the definition of sex.
This is where it gets sticky for women's sports, right?
Right. Absolutely. In fact, by adding the definition of sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity, they are necessarily opening up every sex-separate space that was anticipated to be needed under Title IX.
Sarah Parshall-Perry with the Heritage Foundation.
The regulations and congressional record make that very clear, that men and women, boys and girls, are different and need equal spaces, but require separation in some contexts. All of those spaces, whether it's athletics, locker rooms, bathrooms, single-sex admissions, or dormitories, would all be thrown open to individuals who identify as girls and women, regardless of what their biology is.
Conservative legal scholars like Perry and many feminists say that if men who identify as women can compete against women and share their spaces, it will erase women's sports and privacy.
Some say these changes mean the erasing of women. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely do. In fact, Title IX was passed specifically to guarantee the equality of women. It wasn't to guarantee the equality of men. Men already had full opportunity to compete in interscholastic athletics and to avail themselves of educational opportunities.
One prominent example, NCAA swimmer Leah Thomas, formerly Will Thomas, who became a national champion in the first season competing against women.
This is absolutely wrong. When it comes to women's sports, you cannot say, I support Title IX and women's access to sports and the ability to compete, and then at the same time say it's okay for transgender students who are, men, biological men competing on women's teams. Those cancel each other out, and they're in direct contradiction to one another.
A former Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, reacting on CBN's Faith Nation.
We spent a lot of time regulating on this issue of how campuses, schools must handle issues of sexual misconduct under Title IX. And we put forward a rule that is fair, balanced, that recognizes the right to due process, that respects the complainant, the right of the victim to proceed with a case as they want it to proceed.
One of DeVos's legacies as Education Secretary was changing how schools handle sexual misconduct on campus.
And instead, it will return the college grievance procedure to a guilty until proven innocent standard, giving one Title IX investigator on a college campus all the power in the world to act as judge, jury, and executioner for someone's educational fate.
That too is on the chopping block with the Biden administration's changes. And these changes have to be open to public comment for at least 30 days, after which they can become legally binding. In Washington, D.C., Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Thanks, Jenna. Gordon, back to you.
Well, these are enormous changes, and you go back to the history of Title IX. It was put into place to make sure that women's athletics, women's programs would be fully funded. At that time, there was this huge rise in men's football. Men's basketball are packing out stadiums, and so universities, colleges were throwing a lot of money at men's sports, and it was trying to even the balance so that women could have equal access and equal funding and equal scholarships. All of that is now up in the air, and what does it mean to have transgender competition, and is it the end of women's sports? Just on a fairness, when you look at the biological things that happen when you're born male, what happens with your skeleton, what happens with your muscles, and you then decide in your teen years or young adult years that you really want to identify as female, so I'm going to now go participate in female sports. Well, you have an unfair advantage, and we've already seen that. It's already happened. So where's the fairness in here, and is truly women's sports on the way out as a result of these changes? But when you get the federal government involved and they start saying, well, we're going to cut off all the other federal funds you get unless you come into compliance, well, that's a culture change that I'm pretty sure most Americans aren't ready for.